are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
Well, that was Inauguration Day for the 45th President of the United States, almost 100 days ago now for Donald Trump. He promised a new world for Americans, one he said they'd see in a hurry. So, what have they seen? In a moment, our Turning Point panel. Saeed Khan is a historian and Middle East expert from Wayne State University. He's in Detroit. And here in Toronto, Samantha Nutt, founder of War Child Canada, and Keith Bogue, our Washington correspondent. Their thoughts in a moment. But first, this.
The time for empty talk is over.
So there were lots of signature promises of immediate action. He was going to tear up NAFTA.
NAFTA's been very, very bad.
Tear up the nuclear deal with Iran. Build a wall on the Mexican border, and of course make them pay for it. None of that has happened. He was going to ban Muslims from entering the country.
I am going to keep radical Islamic terrorists the hell out of our country.
Tried.
We will not go away!
Failed.
We'll win that battle.
He was going to have a multi-million-dollar infrastructure program.
We will make America strong again.
He was going to restructure the tax system.
We will make America wealthy again.
Still waiting on those, too. Yep, there were lots of big promises, but none rivaled the big one, the really big one.
Obamacare has been a complete and total catastrophe.
Say goodbye to Obamacare, said the new president. It would be history fast. Wrong-o, buckwheat. It's still very much intact and in law. He did try, but it was a dismal failure, which even his own party couldn't get behind. So the first 100 days, what should we make of it?
We'll see what happens.
Time for some answers. All right, now some people might see that as a very unfair reflection on the first 100 days, or roughly 100 days. He did get his Supreme Court nominee through the system. But, you know, in your view, if you had to find one thing that he delivered on in terms of his promises, what would it be, Sam?
Well, certainly he's delivered on his promise of pro-big business, his anti-regulatory agenda. So, for example, he has systematically gone after the Environmental Protection Agency, putting his own people in there, threatening to gut it by 30%. So unfortunately, he has been successful in some very critical areas that seem to advance his particular position on creating this kind of economic environment for the United States that he considers to be most productive. And unfortunately, there are some really serious consequences from that.
All right. Saeed, what about you? If you had to point to one thing where he has succeeded, where would it be?
Well, I would say his pulling the U.S. out of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that he campaigned on. And I'd like to go ahead and piggyback on what Sam said. One of the things that he has done very effectively is what he pledged to do regarding the Obama-era reforms. Going ahead now and moving ahead with the Keystone XL pipeline, getting the G20 to keep language of climate change out of its joint statement, deregulating the coal industry, and let's face it, I mean, he did succeed in putting out the travel/Muslim bans. It's now in the hands of the court, but he still is one who put those together and said that he was going to implement these within the first 100 days.
All right, Keith, where are you on this?
Well, can we just go back to Neil Gorsuch? Donald Trump,
the Supreme Court nominee.
The Supreme Court appointment that he made. He himself regards that as one of his biggest achievements. So do many conservatives, even some Democrats are pointing to that. But I think the reality is that though it might be the most consequential thing that he has done in his presidency, because Gorsuch could be on the court for 3 or 4 decades, the reality is that that's a victory for the Senator Mitch McConnell, the majority leader there. It was Mitch McConnell who, when that vacancy first came open, more than a year ago, decided that he was not going to have hearings on Barack Obama's appointee, that he was going to do everything he could, whether it was unprecedented, unconstitutional, unconventional, you name it, he didn't care. He was going to keep that seat open for what he hoped would be a Republican president, and he got one. And I think what Donald Trump did was really follow through on what Mitch McConnell had given him, which was an opportunity to fill a seat.
All right. Well, wherever you stand, whether you go with the list of failures or those accomplishments that the three of you have mentioned here already, the fact is, his approval rating is lower than anybody in American history, any other president, at this point in their term. Is it the list of failures that's driven him to that point in the ratings? Saeed?
Well, I think that it's important to remember, Peter, that he won only the electoral vote. He lost the popular vote. He only got 46.4% of the popular vote. So I think it's fair to assume that he's losing some of his base of support. And perhaps that can be explained by his failures, or perhaps the rate of failure. The idea that he came in with a lot of big and bold promises that he was going to get all these things implemented. He hasn't done those. Some of that blame can certainly be on Congress. Some of it is, of course, on just the quality of the ideas themselves, as well as this notion that a people who had been promised so much, were expecting so much, his own pivot on some of these issues has really left a lot of people scratching their heads, particularly in his base.
But if he's holding 90% of those who voted for him, which those numbers would suggest, for a guy who's definitely a polarizing president, that's probably not so bad, given the rate of failure he's had in the first few months.
Absolutely, Peter, and that's the most important piece out of this. The people who love him still love him. They are still with him. The people who never liked him, never trusted him, still don't like him, still don't trust him. And so for a president like Trump, if your primary agenda is to keep appeasing your base, if you look at those numbers, you look at that approval and your popularity within that core group of supporters, I mean, you're looking pretty good right now if you're Trump, because they're with you. And despite all of the things that he has done, whether it's his failure on immigration, his more sort of activist foreign interventions at this moment in time, none of those things seem to have tilted the balance when it comes to how they think of him. They still are with him.
Now, of course, 42% and holding that base is not going to get you reelected. You know, can he recover from these kind of numbers? I mean, it's only 3 months into the presidency, but can he recover?
Well, I guess you have to say yes, because anything's possible. And we've learned through the last 18 months of politics in Washington to never say never about anything. But I think the point being that, you know, he came into this job with historically low disapproval ratings, very, very high negatives, is an important one. And I think what the election told us, even through the result, was that Donald Trump didn't really win the policy argument in the campaign. What he won was a constituency that wanted disruption, and they didn't really think too much about what that was going to mean, but they felt that it was absolutely necessary for it to happen. For him to start improving his numbers now, though, I think he has to start winning the policy arguments. Margaret Thatcher used to say, first you win the argument, then you win the votes. I think that's where he is right now.
You know, Sam, you watch the international scene very carefully on a number of fronts. This is the president who came into office saying America first, and he wasn't going to focus outside of America. The area where he seems to have got the most popular support is when he's been saber-rattling, whether it was North Korea or the cruise missile attacks in Syria. What does that tell us about him and about the situation currently for the U.S.?
Well, I think the only thing it tells us is that the most predictable thing about Donald Trump is his unpredictability. You know, even if you look at the sort of missile attack on Syria, for example, he was able to spin that. I mean, this is a guy who is incredibly astute, whether we like it or not, when it comes to spin. And he's been able to even position that intervention as a way of America being back, demonstrating force, putting their own interests front and forward, making sure that they're not being taken advantage of, making sure that they have that kind of prominence in the world. So here's a guy that isn't afraid of any kind of disconnect between what he said previously and what he's doing now, because as soon as those cameras start rolling, he finds a way to position it as a strength as opposed to a weakness. And for me, the most worrisome part of that is that he's also a guy who's so driven by those ratings that he has a tendency to do again what seemed to have worked for him in the past. And when you're talking about foreign policy, and we saw that too with the attack with Afghanistan, where they dropped the largest non-nuclear weapon that's been used in recent history. You know, here's a guy who's going to go back to those same wells, and what that could mean on a global scale is, for me, the most worrisome part of this.
Spin is right. I mean, they attack an airbase in Syria and 59 Tomahawk missiles, and they don't take out the runway. It looks a little odd. Saeed, do you want to quickly reference this issue, what it tells us about him in terms of those overseas missions?
Well, I think to borrow from Sam as well, this is a clear deflection, and I think it shows that Trump realizes that his domestic agenda is not really being fulfilled. But it also is part of a broader, unfortunately, American arc. We saw this with Ronald Reagan attacking and invading Grenada. We saw this with Bill Clinton in 1998 in order to get attention away from the Monica Lewinsky issue by bombing the Sudan. So it's part of a, unfortunately, an American foreign policy that when a president feels as though he's being addled by low ratings or in order to try to gin up those numbers, it's very easy to then marshal the American public, including the opposition, that does not want to be seen as unpatriotic or unsupportive of a president who goes ahead and invokes security and the need for military action.
Yeah. Didn't Clinton's attack on Sudan ended up a baby milk formula factory?
Formula factory.
It's the wag the dog phenomenon.
Wag the dog.
Yeah.
All right, I want to break it down into a couple of areas about where we are at this point. Keith, what do we assume Trump's top priorities are at this point in his presidency?
Well, I guess we could assume they are what he says they are: make America great again, jobs, 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 repeal and replace Obamacare. Or we could look at what power has revealed about Donald Trump, what his real priorities seem to be. His entire life he has been about making deals and winning. And I think that's very much what animates him right now. I think part of the healthcare debacle, where he got behind a proposal that was really created by Republicans in Congress rather than by the White House, part of that was because he saw the possibility of a deal happening without really understanding all the works behind it, all the interior stuff. Nor did he understand how to get it through Congress. But I think, again, he was motivated simply by the idea that I could have a deal. What the deal was, how it would affect ordinary people, I don't think he cared. And if that's the way he's going to continue, I think that's a difficult path to try to, build a legacy on.
Sam?
I certainly agree with that, but I also think this is one of the challenges when you run as an anti-establishment candidate, because then you're stuck having to negotiate with the very people that you have demeaned and criticized. And to a certain degree, Obama faced this as well. I mean, as he was stepping out of his presidency, one of the biggest criticisms leveled against him was here was a guy who didn't accomplish nearly as much as he'd set out to because he just wasn't able to get the kind of legislation passed because he couldn't build those diplomatic channels. Donald Trump suffers from that too, but I would go a bit further and say that I do think he has systematically intervened with both executive orders and the gutting of the State Department and U.S. foreign aid and the EPA and other regulatory institutions in favor of his pro-big business agenda, anti-regulatory agenda that frankly could be very, very harmful. And so as we focus on these bigger failures of his, those quiet successes that he's having can add up to something that will be, I think, have a major impact on the United States and on Canada potentially in the years ahead.
All right, here's the last question. So you just start us off on it. Is he shaping global conversations? And if he is, how is he doing that?
Oh, I think he most certainly is. I think perhaps the most recent example of that, Peter, is his endorsement, if you will, of Marine Le Pen in the French elections. I mean, the very idea that an American president would give support to, well, let's just go ahead and call it what it is, a fascist political candidate is remarkable. And we find that he has an awful lot of empathy and affinity for these authoritarian leaders. The very first phone call that Recep Erdogan received after the Turkish referendum, which gave him sweeping powers, was from Trump. He also likes Modi, he likes Putin, and so this notion of these populist, nationalist, authoritarian figures is a complete departure from really where America has been for the last several decades. And then, of course, we're looking at China and Russia. Comes into office speaking very tough on China, now has softened his stance, came into office rather soft on Russia, and now has become a little bit more frosty to it. So it's leaving a lot of people scratching a lot of heads.
All right, you get the last word, Keith.
Well, I think the scratching the heads thing is the right way to put it. He's introduced so much uncertainty into the world because he says and does things, and people can't tell whether they are one-offs or whether they're strategic, whether there's a fundamental realignment happening in foreign policy or whether it's just make it up every time you get out of bed in the morning. I think that needs to be straightened out. There are some signs, I think, that it is being straightened out, but that's what's confused the world. Who is this guy really?
All right, good conversation. Thank you all, Saeed in Detroit and Sam and Keith here in Toronto.